There are very, very few reporters who have covered empire with more courage, tenacity, and integrity than Allan Nairn. For more than 3 decades, he has reported from Central America. We met in El Salvador during the war, East Timor, Palestine, South Africa, Haiti, and Indonesia, where Indonesian soldiers fractured his skull and arrested him as he covered the 1991 massacre. His reporting of that massacre saw the Indonesian government brand him a threat to national security and ban him from occupied East Timor, a ban he repeatedly defied. His dogged reporting of torture and killing of civilians by the Indonesian military contributed to the U.S. Congress suspending military aid to Jakarta in 1995. He has explored U.S. complicity with death squads at the risk of his life in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Haiti. During the 2014 presidential elections in Indonesia, where he spends much of his time, Nairn was threatened with arrest for exposing a presidential candidate's role in atrocities. Nairn's reporting on army massacres was an important component in the trial of former Guatemalan President Efrain Rios Montt, who ordered the killing of over 1,200 people alone in the Achille region in the early 1980s. Rios Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, sentenced to 80 years in prison, although this conviction sadly was finally overturned. Welcome me today in my introduction to one of America's finest and most important investigative journalists, Allan Nairn.
When the West Point chaplain did the invocation at last year's Army-Navy game, he called for the Lord and the cadets to visit violence on the enemies of the world. It is inspiring to think about going out and visiting justice on the wicked. It's noble to put your life on the line to defend your loved ones and community. And if that were indeed what the United States was doing in the world today, I'd be encouraging everyone to sign up. But given the actual facts, I'm calling on everyone to resist. Our country is going wrong, and decent people have a responsibility to stand up and try to stop it. I grew up in the public schools pledging allegiance to the US flag. But later in Guatemala, when I saw that flag on boxes of ammo in army massacre camps and heard the rotors of armed US-supplied helicopters beating over the ruins of burnt, butchered villages, I have to admit that I grew tense and repelled, revolted when I saw our flag. And that was just me, an American. Think how the survivors felt. Later in El Salvador, I sat with General Medrano, the asset of the CIA and the founder of his country's death squads. The general didn't just explain to me that the raped and murdered US nuns were communists, or that his country's laborers and peasants were all Moscow pawns. He also showed me the merit plaque given to him by the Green Berets and the silver medal for exceptionally meritorious service given to him in the Oval Office by President Johnson. One could see the results of this US death squad collaboration on the streets and the mountains outside. Perhaps 70,000 civilians dead, bodies dumped with tongues cut out, without genitals. This US creation and/or support of forces that repress and kill civilians was and is routine. It is the daily work of a violence bureaucracy that functions so normally, so smoothly, that most Americans, most reporters, most legislators barely know or acknowledge it exists. There have been and are at least 100 operations like the US operations like this worldwide. Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Argentina, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Grenada, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Congo, Nigeria, Rwanda, Kenya, Somalia, Mali, Morocco, Western Sahara, Ethiopia, Egypt, Algeria, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Qatar, Bahrain, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Turkey, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, Korea, Timor, West Papua, Indonesia, and even in the heart of Europe, Italy, France, and Greece post-World War II, and later direct gratuitous bombing attacks on Serbia, targeting trains, infrastructure, and journalists in a TV station. This list is partial. We have time constraints. But the impact is so massive that it alters the world and the United States in basic ways. This US practice kills a lot of civilians, millions, and also pulls down wages worldwide and sends people running for cover as refugees and immigrants. First, on the wages, US support for foreign repression is a godsend for big corporations. As an investment journal put it, praising labor repression in Indonesia, it's a good place to invest because, it claimed, the local labor force is docile and disciplined. All of this because of, quote, the underlying threat of force. At the Coca-Cola plant in Guatemala City, on the cafeteria wall, they had a row of photos of the union leaders who had been disappeared or assassinated. Fred Sherwood, a leader of the American Chamber of Commerce in Guatemala, explained to me that if workers at his Canaf plant caused trouble, he would turn their names over to the police, and the workers would literally disappear. He told a joke about how the police commander, Chupina, was so adept at torture that rumor in the business community had it that he could make a mummy talk. All this tends to encourage, as the business parlance has it, labor flexibility. It pulls down wages and makes US companies want to relocate overseas, which in turn makes US workers flexible, pulling down wages here. Second, on people running for cover. If they live fairly close to here, they often tend to try to immigrate to the United States, the country that arms and pays their torturers, because over decades Americans have won civil liberties. It's repressive here. And because, in part, this is where the profits flow, and US unions have in the past increased wages higher here than in their labor-repressed home countries. Donald Trump knows a lot about repressed foreign labor. He uses it to make his clothesline, but he's shrewd enough to lie about it when he's on TV. He calls them rapists. He says they don't send their best here. If Trump uttered such slanders about white Americans, or spoke of Jews or Christians as he speaks about Muslims, he would be marginalized by the US elites. He wouldn't get on TV. But fortunately for Trump, the US networks are just racist enough that with those chosen targets, they let him get away with it. And they know that what Trump says is false. The crime rates are lower among those who are undocumented, and corporate employers know that they do send their best. The immigrants reliably staff the agribusiness and meat packing and other industries. They work diligently and, if undocumented, have to fear the US state. For the rich US employer who can cut them loose or turn them in, it's a kind of daily double. Malleable workers fall into their laps, and meanwhile, overseas, the workers' repressed cousins work for even less, creating the threat of moving production there if stateside workers rebel. US support for foreign repression is very good for US CEOs. And for those who propose to solve this problem by walling out the fleeing victims, if you don't want the neighbors camping on your lawn, don't burn down their houses in the first place. If you feel the need to build a wall, build it around the Pentagon and CIA. And tell the armed guards in the watchtowers, don't let anyone out. We always hear that there is conflict between government and the private sector. But that's only true when government is at least in part in public hands, when the government isn't wholly owned by the corporations themselves. That's the way it partly was in the 60s and the 70s, when Ralph and others did their landmark work. But the rich fought back, and by Bill Clinton's time, both parties were again thoroughly corporate. Clinton rammed through NAFTA. It wasn't easy. It passed by a sliver in the House. On the day NAFTA went into effect, the Zapatistas in Mexico staged their rebellion. I asked Subcomandante Marcos, did you ever think of staging your uprising before the congressional vote? I had worked with Ralph against NAFTA. I told Marcos an earlier uprising probably would have killed it. He replied that it had not occurred to them that they could have possibly had such far-flung clout. There's a lesson there for all lost causes. They're not all lost. You never know. The mislabeled trade deals like NAFTA, WTO, and today TPP complete the work that repression has begun. The US, followed by others, arms and trains the torturers, helping sustain the low-wage havens, and the trade deals grease the skids, helping the exploiting CEOs exit the US smiling. And then, with the US working middle class collapsing, with millions of Americans hurting, the US elite acts surprised when a racist pipsqueak demagogue arises. Recognizing that the US public saw that their jobs weren't just vaporizing, they were going foreign, Trump cried out, yes, let's blame the foreigners. Let's unleash the inner beast in white America. The US elite, which has implemented both the foreign repression and the trade deals, is suddenly a little worried about the rise of a form of fascism with Trump, when it is precisely their policies that set the stage for his rise in the first place, and when they have been sponsoring overseas fascisms for years. Fascism isn't good enough for America, but it was good enough for Chile. Better, in fact, than elected democracy. So much better that we had to, in Nixon's words, make the economy scream, to overthrow democracy and then support a program of mass executions of those who dared to resist. Fascism isn't good enough for America, but it was good enough for Indonesia. So much so that in the Clinton White House's words, General Suharto was our kind of guy. And the massacre of perhaps 1 million that consolidated Suharto's rule was a gleam of light and progress, in the words of the New York Times. That fascism was so good for Indonesia that Ford and Kissinger could personally give the green light to an invasion of East Timor that produced the greatest proportional slaughter since the Nazis, 1/3 of the population dead, almost all civilians, the same percentage slaughter as that of the Jews of Europe by the Nazis. But it's also quite revealing to note about the US foreign violence system that when years later I asked President Ford about that fateful go-ahead, he said he couldn't remember it because at the meeting that day, there were so many higher priority matters on the table between the US and its guy, Suharto. In other words, a US president sponsors death in so many countries that he needs post-it notes on his desk to keep them straight. No one person can remember that many. That's why they need a violence bureaucracy. When later at a public forum, I asked Kissinger if he was ready to stand trial, he replied, quote, "It is questions like this that make the conduct of foreign policy impossible." And he had a point. If officials like him were criminally accountable for their actions, the conduct of foreign policy in its current form would become impossible. President Bush Jr. had it right. If you arm a terrorist, you are a terrorist. What the US does in its worldwide violence system is prosecutable on a host of grounds: local murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, and rape statutes, terrorism, international humanitarian and war law. In 2013, I got a call that absolutely stunned me. The US protege, General Rios Montt, The Guatemalan dictator who used to work a few blocks from here, when he ran the US-backed Inter-American Defense College, was coming to trial in Guatemala on a charge of genocide. I was asked to testify. In the end, I was blocked by the country's president, another massacre general, whom I'd met during the slaughter. But given the chance, I would have described how the army swept through the villages, how the US military attaché told me how he helped design the tactics, how they made people dig their own mass graves, how they strangled, decapitated, crucified, how they slit open pregnant women and bombed and strafed villages from US aircraft, and how after it was all over, I had asked General Rios Montt if he thought that he should stand trial for mass murder, and if given his support for the death penalty, if he thought he himself should be executed. Rios Montt, like Kissinger, gave a telling reply. He leapt to his feet and exclaimed, "Yes, try me, put me against the wall. But if you try me, you must also try the Americans, including Ronald Reagan," he said. As the court read out its long, detailed guilty genocide verdict against Rios Montt, I stood in the courtroom trying to absorb what Guatemala's heroic Mayan survivors had accomplished, and also trying to imagine a comparable level of civilization here. A trial of Bush Jr. in Texas for the invasion of Iraq. A trial of Obama in Illinois for the killing of civilians by drones. But my imagination couldn't stretch that far. We're less advanced than Guatemala. But the facts are there, the law is there, and all that's needed is the courage. We exported terror to Guatemala. We should import some justice back here. And if we started enforcing the law against presidents, just enforce the murder laws, I expect it would also get easier to enforce the law against racist cops who use US arms to kill civilians on our streets, as well as at US borders. The US has for centuries recognized the legitimacy of war reparations. The US should be paying them to every nation it has illegally attacked, and it should compensate the families of civilians killed by government personnel, foreign or domestic, with at a minimum the full-term salary of the serving US president. Now, these notions may sound outrageous, but that's because the underlying US conduct is. If the US weren't killing so many civilians and doing so many unlawful attacks, such reparations would be routine law compliance and wouldn't be such budget busters. It's important to note that in this discussion, I have not yet begun to speak on US operations that involve Americans in actual war. That's because, counter to myth, the predominant work of the US violent system does not involve two-sided armed combat, but rather committing or facilitating one-sided repression. In the deployment of arms and coercion against, it's the deployment of arms and coercion against unarmed or inactive populations. What the Pentagon spin-off, the RAND Corporation, refers to as US support for repressive, non-democratic governments, as well as for repressive democratic ones. Our other, less blunt commentators use terms like support for maintaining the security architecture, but it's the same. When you talk about the main foreign work of the foreign intelligence, military, police system, varieties of repression is usually what you're talking about. And experience shows that, also counter to myth, you usually don't reap what you sow. The people united are frequently defeated. They're often placed in graves. Most of the time, killing civilians works, but now and then it doesn't. And that leads us to the complex war situations that dominate the news today. When you kill off the bravest or smartest in a country, that can give your unjust system a free ride. But now and then it can backfire, especially when the policy of being willing to murder causes you to create a violence bureaucracy with an insatiable structural need for enemies. Occasionally, history provides you with enemies that are actually threatening, or at least sellable enough to rationalize your pay or to keep you busy rather than idle at the office all day. But sometimes history falters and the enemy supply runs low. There is actually a Washington term for this, enemy deprivation syndrome. That was coined by a Kissinger aide. But there is a cure for this syndrome, provocation. After the Soviet empire collapsed, NATO had nothing to do until decades of aggressive NATO expansion and prodding finally revived the Russian threat. Last year in Afghanistan, an Afghan general, the army spokesman and an old mujahid, told me in great detail how the US had goaded the Russians, whom he hates, into invading Afghanistan. His account meshed precisely with that of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the old US NSC chief who boasted to the French press that provocation was a major triumph, with only the negligible side effect of leaving behind, quote, a few riled up Muslims, i.e., the US creation, in concert with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, of the CIA-paid, heavily armed anti-Soviet force, the Mujahideen, whom Reagan called the freedom fighters, the precursors of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and then in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. That US-provoked Russian invasion was, in a way, the first boulder of the current avalanche, the one that has buried Afghanistan and several other countries in chaos and corpses. When I met Afghan President Ghani last year, he spoke mainly off the record, but it seemed like, in ways, he shared the perspective of many others in current Afghan life. The society is so disrupted, the new violence post-US invasion has been so deep, that many feel that you now can't have impact unless you have a pack of killers behind you. They may be warlords, they may be Taliban, they may be NATO, the Americans, but unless you have at least one of them killing for you, you won't be heard in Afghan politics. It's even worse in Iraq, Libya, Syria. It's easy to provoke, create enemies. But once you've done it, the situation sometimes escapes your control. And no use of your self-conferred license to kill can restore a semblance of calm, profitable, repressed order. Last year in the US, I met a group of intellectuals from the most embattled Middle East states, and they insisted, counter to my argument, that the White House was running ISIS. This was especially noteworthy given that they'd been selected and brought here by the State Department. They were reflecting a widely held view. That's how tough and bitter things have now gotten in that zone of the violent system. US policymakers often excuse themselves by saying they face hard choices. But when you're talking about the violent system, that's a grossly deceptive view. Indeed, some choices are now hard regarding places like Iraq and Syria, but that's only because the US helped create this mess when facing simple choices in the first place. Simple, almost all choices in the US violent system, that's what they are. They are not remotely hard. Should you topple Honduran democracy like Hillary Clinton did? No. Should you suppress the Haitian minimum wage, again like Hillary did? No. Should you create and pay the Haitian death squad FRAP like Bill Clinton did? No. Should you support the Indonesian mass killers? Of course not. In unending countless cases, the setting and action of the US violent system is clearly, unequivocally wrong. It's not hard. Wrong morally by any decent standard, wrong practically for regular US workers, and often legally, criminally wrong. The US shouldn't have been goading a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the first place. The US shouldn't have been using Assad and Gaddafi to torture prisoners. It shouldn't have invaded Iraq. And after having committed that supreme crime of aggression, it shouldn't have opened fire on the demonstrators in Fallujah and elsewhere, nor brought in US Colonel Steele from El Salvador, they actually called it the Salvador option, to back Interior Ministry death squads targeted against Sunnis. The U.S. shouldn't have had General Petraeus cleanse and wall up Baghdad on ethnic religious lines, and it shouldn't have backed Prime Minister Maliki, who was handled by Bush directly from the White House, when he increased the exclusion and state killing of Sunnis. The U.S. shouldn't have flooded the world in the Middle East with more weapons than Satan could swallow, and it shouldn't have worked with its close allies, the Saudis, Turkey, and Qatar, as they armed and created what became ISIS feeders and precursors, ostensibly to fight Assad. The U.S. objections to Assad's barrel bombs, its pretense of being a mediator, would carry more weight if it hadn't given cluster bombs to Israel and Saudi Arabia, which they used to shred flesh and personalities in southern Lebanon and now Yemen, respectively. And if the U.S. wants to claim to be an honest broker in the Middle East, either start arming the Palestinians or stop arming the Israelis. You could go on for a day like this. The current no-exit catastrophe is in large part the outgrowth of decisions that were easy, were wrong, and in many cases should be charged as criminal. And by the way, don't let anyone tell you that this violent system and its murder doctrine is a thing of the past. Just 2 months ago in Honduras, still haunted by the Hillary Clinton-backed coup, the indigenous anti-dam activist Berta Cáceres was assassinated in her home. Investigators say it looks like another corporate hit ordered out from US-trained security forces. In Aceh in Indonesia, ExxonMobil hired the Kopassus Special Forces, the unit most heavily trained by the US, to guard their natural gas plant and gave them, on company grounds, a torture, gang rape, and execution center. Exxon even provided bulldozers to help the Army dig the mass graves. When victims' families sued in US court, Exxon hired Sri Srinivasan, the lawyer and judge now in line for the Supreme Court should the Democrats retain the White House. Srinivasan tried to gut the statute, the Alien Tort Claims Act, that allows the victims to sue here, and then he argued that regardless of fact, as a matter of law, corporate persons cannot be held responsible for crimes against humanity. The machine is up and running. Obama has kept it set on kill. He has continued the US backing for repressive forces around the world. And he has created a new drone bureaucracy that structurally needs daily targets to kill. Pentagon planners have what they call the bug splat program for estimating civilian deaths from airstrikes. On the first day of the Iraq invasion, they authorized strikes predicted to leave 600 bugs, civilians, dead. The drone bureaucrats have their own concepts. Children in the drone site are fun-sized terrorists. Many times they don't even know who they're killing. They can only see they are young or armed men. This, by the way, in a place where, like the US, many regular people carry weapons. One of the US droners' concepts is the double tap, the follow-up strike that kills the emergency medical service rescuers. It sure is a perverse way of honoring the memories of the New York rescuer heroes who gave their lives on 9/11. And what about terrorism? What are you supposed to do? Well, first thing, stop committing it. If the US stops killing civilians, those civilians will still be alive. And then there's the likely added benefit that Americans will be saved too. Tom Brokaw has described the war on terror as the war against Islamic rage. Perhaps a way to diminish Islamic rage is to kill fewer Islamic people, a principle that one would think would make sense with any faith. During 2015, it was amazingly enough recorded, the US dropped 23,144 bombs on Muslim-majority countries. As former US-installed president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, often pointed out, such US bombs regularly caused airborne massacres of wedding parties. How would you feel if someone bombed your wedding? What are you supposed to feel, delighted? I suspect that for any religion, Rage would be the chosen response. Jürgen Todenhofer, the brave German reporter who spent 10 days with ISIS and emerged alive, had this to say: "We should withdraw all troops from the Middle East and stop all bombing. At the beginning of the war on terror, there were 200 jihadists in the Hindu Kush. Now there are 100,000 all over the Middle East." Sometimes a situation is so bad, so ugly, that even if you're under attack, it doesn't make sense, even for legitimate defense, to fire back, because it will only make matters worse. In '91, I was in a situation where I briefly considered doing a mass shooting myself. Outside a cemetery in East Timor, the Indonesian army was marching, M16s raised, and it was evident that they had orders to stage a massacre of peaceful mourners and protesters. I thought if we foreigners went to the front of the crowd and faced the soldiers, it might stop them. It didn't. As they enveloped and beat us, I briefly thought about wrenching away a rifle and trying to kill them. But the soldiers filled the road. There were maybe thousands of them. It would only have made matters worse. Violence is sometimes justified, but almost always it isn't. And even when it is, it very frequently doesn't make any sense. But again, remember, these tough situations, tough calls, are not mainly what we're talking about. The U.S. violence system is mainly straight-up repression. We have to stop it and dismantle it and bring those who abet murder to trial. Finally, we should also remember that criminal enforcement is only partial. It can get criminals out of suites and White Houses, and it can deter future mass murders, but to address the larger death toll from hunger and exploitation-borne diseases, you have to stop the draining of people's labor and change the rules and location of wealth. You have to move dollars from the pockets of people who merely want them to those of people who truly need them. Move those dollars from people who have reached the point where they use them for fun and prestige to those who are at the point where they need them for survival and decency. It's interesting that corporations and rich people are all in on the idea of charity, but not so much on the idea of government spending financed by taxes, i.e. charity that is truly broad, systematic, and at least in theory guided by democratic selection. They are even less enthusiastic about rewriting the rules so that an hour's work yields an hour's pay, not many thousands of hours worth, as it currently does for indoor rich world investors. But any march towards social justice must begin with the words of Bishop Romero, who said to the El Salvadoran troops, "I beseech you, I command you, in the name of God, stop the repression." One day after he said that, Bishop Romero was assassinated in a chapel. But his word got through. To effectively march for any kind of justice, you've got to get to your destination before US-trained troops with M16s emerge from far below heaven and kill you. Thank you.
I want to talk today a little bit about our foreign policy and how we got there and where we might go from here in a better direction. But before I do, I want to make one comment about a person who has been mentioned several times today, including just 1 minute ago by our last speaker, and that was Archbishop Romero of El Salvador. So I worked in El Salvador during the period when he was active, and I remember a conversation with him very vividly, and it's taken on more meaning as time has passed. I remember saying to Romero once something like this: "You are speaking out in very bold terms. You're being really explicit about what's happening in this country. And very powerful people who are murderous are very unhappy with what you're saying. You're really going beyond the boundaries of polite comment. Do you feel this is logical in the situation that you're in? Don't you think you're pushing things a little bit too far?" And Romero had a wonderful answer, which I'm still pondering. He said, I have to do what I have to do. There may be other people who have to do what they have to do, and I don't have any control over them, but I have control over me, and I'm going to do what I have to do. Well, it's great to be here in Washington in this wonderful hall, but I must say I come to Washington as little as possible. Every time I do, I am struck by how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy in this city and in this country. If you do not accept dozens and dozens of premises about America and America's role in the world, you're excluded from the foreign policy conversation. You have to believe in the exceptional nature of the United States. You have to believe that America is the enforcer of the world system. When I start out my course at Brown on the history of American intervention, I give a few rules to the kids in the class in the first minutes, like don't use your cell phone and so forth. And I tell them, I don't want you eating in class either. Then I take out a big sandwich and I start munching on it. And with my mouth full, I say, eating in class, that's so awful. It's disrespectful and it's disruptive. I'm swallowing my food. And I say, you see, I'm like the United States. I make the rules, but I don't have to follow them. You have to accept that this is a legitimate role for the United States in order to participate in the foreign policy discussion. You also have to believe that coercive power is the real way the world runs. You have to believe that the world is comprised of good and evil, and that force is often necessary because force is the only language that evil understands. Now, in many other cultures, people don't grow up believing in the good-evil dichotomy. They grow up believing that there's good and evil in all of us, and these come out in different proportions according to different situations. If you believe that, you're not entitled to participate in foreign policy making in the United States. And we would be sinful if we did not go out and try to share with everyone in the world the goodness of our society. And the fact that there are people out there who don't want our influence just shows how backward they are and makes us think even more firmly that we have to go in and tell them what to do. So shaping parts of the world, like shaping the Middle East, is a big part of the American concept. And it never seems to occur to us that actually many people around the world have cultures of their own that are very old and predate the United States, and they have other ways of living that are different from ours. And just as their systems and lives would not be valid for us, ours are not valid for them. There is no universally applicable rule of what a good society is like. When George Bush said, if the truths of our founding fathers are true for us, they're true for all people, he was wrong. They were right for us. They were not right for all people. Now, one effect of this Washington echo chamber plays out in the way foreign policy and world events are covered in the American press, particularly with the shrinking size of American foreign correspondence. An increasing amount of news that we read about the world actually doesn't come from the world. It comes from Washington, D.C. So our news about the Syrian war is largely, for example, coming from Washington. Who produces the news about the world that we read that comes out of Washington? Well, journalists, of course, are based in Washington. They're in this echo chamber. When an event happens, they need to check out what happened. Or when an American project is being planned overseas, they have to try to understand it. So what do? They call a wide variety of sources. They not only call the White House, they also call the Pentagon. Then they call the State Department. And then they call a few of those think tanks that we heard about earlier. By then, they've covered the whole landscape and they can write their story. This is why you have such narrow-minded and ignorant reporting about places like Syria coming out all over the United States. It's because the people are reporting from inside this echo chamber. The link between what's happening and what in the real world and what we think is happening inside this echo chamber is almost non-existent. It's a completely self-enclosed circle. Now, the great challenge, the great obstacle, the great difficulty the central issue in our foreign policy is, and has for many years been, intervention. This is the great question that hangs over us when we think about how the United States should approach the world. Where do we intervene? When? Under what circumstances? With what tools? These are questions that the United States faces all the time. There's no country in the world that has intervened more often in more parts of the world over a longer period of time than the United States. So intervention is always at the heart of our foreign policy discussions. One reason we like to intervene in other countries is because we like to feel, we tell ourselves that we are liberating people in other countries. We develop this fantasy that essentially everyone in the world is an unformed and unfinished American. Inside every human soul is an American wanting to get out. Therefore, we convince ourselves that if there are nations that don't like us and don't approve of what we're doing, it can only be for one of two reasons. One is that they don't know us. They don't know how good we are. And the other is they actually do like us, but there's a thin layer on top of their society of evil people, a few thugs. Just go kill those people, peel that layer off, and the natural American in every person will blossom. Then they will love us. It doesn't seem to matter how many times this approach is proven wrong. Not only are we continuing to intervene in other countries around the world, but we are continuing to suffer the bad effects of our past interventions. And this is not only visible in places where hot wars are going on, like in Libya, for example, or in Afghanistan. Each one of these interventions that the United States has carried out has a huge backstory and a huge forward story. We tend to forget these interventions very quickly. We go in, then we leave, we accomplish our goal, at least in the short term, and then we forget. And we're astonished that the people in the target country don't forget too. They remember. The memory of American intervention burns and festers in the hearts and souls and minds of people in other countries. It can take years or decades or generations for it to explode, but it always does. These interventions have long-term consequences, some predictable, some unpredictable. And these consequences are almost never taken into account when we set off on interventions. We like to believe that there may be problems down the road, but after all, we're America, so we'll be able to solve them. Now, we are, with our technology and all of our power, able to resolve many kinds of conflicts in the world. We can resolve conflicts that have to do with technology, that have to do with the environment. But culture doesn't respond that way. People in other countries have deep-seated cultures, and they don't want those cultures disrupted by outsiders. And when outsiders come to disrupt them, it causes trouble on both sides. Each one of these interventions can be told this way. Let me just hit on one story as an example. Many of you know this story, so please bear with me. In 1953, the government of Iran decided to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. Soon after that, the British and the Americans colluded to carry out a coup and overthrow that government. So it seemed like the perfect success. It only took about 3 weeks. It didn't even cost $1 million. Maybe 100 people were killed, no Americans. And, best of all, we got rid of a guy we didn't like, Prime Minister Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. Seemed like the perfect ending. Now, in the writing business, we have a lot of truisms. One is, every story is either happy or sad, depending on where you end it. If we could just end the story of Iran right after we put the Shah back in, fine. But history doesn't stop like that. History keeps on unfolding. So let's just briefly trace what happened. The Shah ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. At the end of that period, in the late 1970s, that produced the outburst that we call the Islamic Revolution. That revolution brought to power a clique of fiercely anti-American mullahs who have been working for 35 years intently and sometimes quite violently to attack the interests of the United States. That revolution of 1979 also emboldened Saddam Hussein in next-door Iraq. He thought, well, Iran is in turmoil, I'll invade. When he did that, we embraced Saddam Hussein. We provided him with helicopters, and we provided him with targeting information because we were so angry at the Iranians. That began our death embrace with Saddam that spiraled down into what we are now seeing in Iraq. That Islamic revolution also terrified the Soviets. They were afraid Islamic radicalism would spread along their southern border. That helped propel them to invade Afghanistan. That brought us into Afghanistan and started the spiral down into the horrors that we're seeing in Afghanistan now. So a lot of history came from those 3 weeks in Tehran in the summer of 1953. It didn't wind up good for Iranians, and it didn't wind up good for Americans. If we had not done that, if we had allowed Mossadegh to stay in power, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 60 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the Middle East might be. Multiply that by our interventions all over the world, and you get a sense for what an impact the United States has when it chooses to crash into situations that it doesn't understand. In my course, I talk about the Monroe Doctrine and then the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So Monroe Doctrine, of course, said that only the United States had the right to intervene in Latin America. No outside power did. And the Roosevelt corollary added an enforcement provision that we will be the, what he called, international police power. In case anybody misbehaves, we will fix it. What we've now done is we've taken the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary and we've expanded them to the whole world. So nobody else may intervene, and we have the right to intervene everywhere. The reason is, according to our own self-image, other countries are very selfish. They're greedy. They act in their own private interest. They're not acting in the interests of humanity. We are. That's why we don't have to follow the rules that other countries follow. And I really believe that many American leaders are truly puzzled at why the United States is widely seen as a bully. They feel like we're only trying to help people. Why don't they understand that we're trying to help them? This is something we have been saying for 100 years. And it has been one of the dominant forces in shaping the world of today. It's one of the reasons why the world is in such upheaval today. Now, what would be a more rational approach to the world? First of all reliable foreign policies are based on national interest. It's not realistic to plan a long-term foreign policy that doesn't reflect national interests. Every country has interests, but within your long list of interests, you also have a much smaller list, and that's your vital interests. Those are the interests for which countries go to war. Because countries go to war for their vital interests, it's important to keep the list of vital interests as short as possible. During the Cold War, our list of vital interests was staggeringly long. We felt that we were in imminent danger if there would be land reform in Guatemala. United States security would be devastated if communists won in Vietnam. Every place in the world seemed like a vital interest to us. Now, one of the problems in our foreign policy is it doesn't change as the world changes. We're not agile. We don't change our foreign policies as the world changes. So we came to the end of the Cold War, and everything should have changed. You heard earlier the stories about NATO expansion, but this was also a moment at which the United States might have essentially declared victory and walked home. So let's think about vital interests. We did not readjust our vital interests from 100 down to about 6, which we should have done at the end of the Cold War. we still feel we have vital interests everywhere. But actually, those interests are not vital. It is not a vital interest of ours to resolve civil wars in the Middle East. It is not a vital interest of ours to assure Israeli dominance of the Palestinians. It is not a vital interest of ours to limit Russia's influence in its neighborhood. You can go on and on. These are interests, but they're not vital to us. Then you go down to another level of interest. It's in our interest that girls be able to go to school in Afghanistan, and it's in our interest that bloggers not be hacked to death in Bangladesh. But that is not a purpose for us to go to war. Just because bad people are doing bad things is not an excuse. It's not a call for the United States. We tend to think that the urgency of American intervention increases as the situation abroad gets worse. So if it doesn't seem so bad and not many people are being killed, we won't intervene. But if it gets quite violent, we feel the argument for intervention has grown. That's the wrong argument. We should not become more willing to intervene when situations abroad become more violent. We should become more willing to intervene when it really looks likely that our intervention will produce some benefit. And that's so rare. Military power is not our power of last resort. It's usually our power of first resort. Look at our presidential campaign. You didn't hear people talking about how they're going to bring peace to any part of the world. It's all about who's going to make more war. So let me get back to vital interests. What would be vital interests for the United States? We have to make sure that the United States is never attacked with weapons of mass destruction. We want to be sure that wars in other countries do not spill over into the United States. We want to protect the global trade routes on which our prosperity depends. I would add one more to that. Unlike some other countries, America's strategic power is based largely on the attraction of our example. Nobody in the world looks at Russia or China or Saudi Arabia and thinks, gee, I wish we could live like that. But people by the millions think that way about the United States. As our political institutions erode, as our society becomes more unjust, as our political system becomes more theatrical and less real, people in the outside world lose confidence in our example, and that undermines our world power. That is the vital interest. So let's whittle down the number of vital interests to a very few. And then tell ourselves, if one of these few vital interests is not threatened, we're not fighting, we're not going to war. Because war should be something that you launch on to save your own nation. And if you're not saving your own nation, you shouldn't be going to war. We have now managed to dress up intervention in so many different ways. The old Cheney-Rumsfeld vocabulary has been discredited. Now we have humanitarian intervention. I love that one. This is a phrase that now goes on my list of euphemisms along with extraordinary rendition. How about enhanced interrogation methods, collateral damage? One I love is ordnance was expended. So, let's not fall for the same old package wrapped up in a little nicer string. That's what humanitarian intervention is. Now, I think we're in a very interesting moment politically in the history of American intervention. There was a tremendous national movement that exploded in 1898, 1899, 1900 against the beginnings of American expansionism. I happen to know this because that's the subject of my next book. The Anti-Imperialist League was a huge force in America for several years, and the debate in the Senate over whether we should get into the business of imperialism is exactly on the issues that we are debating today. You see exactly the same subjects, except, of course, that the debaters are so much more sophisticated and so much more articulate. So this last few months of political campaigning has cast an interesting light on the intervention project. First of all, the unfolding of the Republican primary process produced a remarkable result, among many others, and that was that all the candidates who seriously supported mainstream American interventionist foreign policy fell away from the field quite early. Jeb Bush was supposed to be the anointed prince of the neocon establishment. He never got traction. Marco Rubio, who was the classic neocon and whose foreign policy most closely matches that of Hillary Clinton, also fell off the wagon. The remaining candidates at the end, Cruz, Kasich, and Trump, all were people who were off the playbook in different ways. None of them fully endorses the Washington approach to intervention. There isn't anywhere in the Republican Party among the senior presidential candidates who would embrace the neocon movement or who the neocon movement could embrace. That's why they're all rushing over to Hillary. But it's very interesting to me that so many Republican voters were willing to vote against candidates who were echoing the Washington line on foreign intervention. And you saw a somewhat similar phenomenon on the Democratic side, where Bernie Sanders, although he didn't make foreign policy his key issue, definitely attacked Hillary Clinton specifically on being, as he called it, too trigger happy. So this issue has now moved center stage. It is apparently likely that we're going to get a highly interventionist-oriented president at the end of this year. But I think the political climate has opened up. I do believe that in both parties we're seeing a questioning of the interventionist ethos. You're not seeing that here in Washington. Here, everything is still controlled by the liberal, conservative, Republican, Democratic echo chamber. But out there in the real world, I sense that there is a growing disquiet, a growing understanding that relentless intervention in foreign conflicts does not help resolve those conflicts, and it doesn't serve our own interests. It's not good for anybody. These are heretical views here in Washington, but they're becoming more and more acceptable out in real America. So I think the fact that we've had leading candidates in both parties denounce the interventionist paradigm is a remarkable result of this campaign. And I think it opens up fertile ground for all of us. Keep that in mind. I believe we could be at a moment when many people who we might have thought were unapproachable on this issue have become approachable. This is not a standard left-right issue. This is an issue about looking coldly at what's good for us. So think about that. Think about the new opportunities that are out there as so many millions of Americans begin to rethink this idea that's been drilled into them relentlessly for so long that we have to intervene everywhere in the world, and without us, the world will go into chaos. They're starting to rethink this. That's fertile ground for us. So when you go back home, just remember, you got to do what you got to do. Thank you.